So here we are. I want to say there was bound to be a Russia-Ukraine video at some point. I knew I was going to make a Russia-Ukraine video for obvious reasons. And there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot that I could talk about. I have the flag. It's the first time, probably one of the few times, if ever, that I'm going to actually celebrating, I guess, not celebrating, expressing a popular political issue. But yeah, it's kind of necessary in this particular situation. Now, I want to say right off the bat, as the intro to this video, that I was not anticipating the sheer level. Like, I couldn't imagine the sheer level of bad takes and misinterpretations of an issue, and I get that happen in an incident like this. And I wonder if this is just something that's unique to geopolitics in general. I wonder that if and when a geopolitical event happens, this is just what always happens. The volume of bad takes skyrockets. And I think the reason is that geopolitics is honestly probably the highest, most complex level of political discourse there is. This is something I've been thinking about a whole lot throughout this whole thing. Is just the nature and way of thinking about geopolitical analysis. So a huge chunk of this video is going to be just me talking about that. You need to know so much to do correct geopolitical analysis. Like you need to know so many little things, so many things that aren't readily available. You need to know history, but not even just history. You need to know details. You need to know specific things that have happened, the context in which they happened, differences between cultures, differences between, philosophies, identities, all sorts of things that aren't even readily available from just regular Wikipedia research. Obviously, everyone has a basic sense of what's going on in any geopolitical analysis. But the specifics lean things in one direction or another, and also the specifics elevate some of the positions and takes that you could have. It's not the case that simply being for or against a war or for and against a country is all that matters. There's a lot of people that are pro-Ukraine in this whole thing that I would say don't have quite the correct take on the situation. They either don't support Ukraine enough, in my opinion, or they don't support them in exactly the correct manner for the correct reason. It's another thing is like in geopolitics, a lot of people look at this stuff as if it's literally just team sports, as if it's one team versus another. The purpose of geopolitical analysis is not to look at anything like team sports. Every geopolitical incident, specifically to do with war, it's not about whose team you're on. That's for the memes. But what's for is for who's right and who's wrong. For what's right and what's wrong. That's what actually matters. And I'm going to make a point that this is also probably the reason that geopolitics gets people as angry and riled up as it does. I have a feeling that compared to just domestic political issues, geopolitics, the level of tension and outrage over geopolitics is way bigger. And it would make sense because the stakes are higher, right? When it comes to geopolitics, what you're discussing, at least most commonly, is war and the justifiability of war and just behavior in war. And of course, when war is what's at stake, when violence is literally what's at stake, of course everyone's going to be the most riled up when genocide's at stake, right? I also want to say that knowing multiple languages, so the reason I think my take on this whole Russia-Ukraine thing is different, even compared to many pro-Ukrainian people in the West, is simply because I know the two countries. Knowing multiple countries, knowing multiple languages, knowing the context of multiple countries absolutely affects your interpretation of the situation and not just what's happening, but what's real. It's the same thing as it's not even just knowing cultures and cultural contexts. It goes beyond that. I would even say knowing languages affects things. It completely it creates a whole new vein of thinking on the issue, because a new language is a new way of thinking. Knowing multiple languages, it's more than just a tool that makes it quicker to understand certain things. It's a whole new way of thinking. It's like Wittgenstein said, your language is the limits of your world. I see that, on the forefront in the Russia-Ukraine thing. So many people, English speakers, don't fully understand the Russian world simply because they don't understand the Russian language. And it's important to note that you don't even fully get the information you need through interpreters, because what interpreters do when they translate is they take the words and they find the simplest corresponding meaning in the language they're translating to. The purpose of it is simplicity to get the logic across. But what they're not communicating is the linguistic context of the words that are being used in the language that's being translated from. It's kind of weird to explain, and this is a whole other complex discussion, but the point is that different languages are not just different sets of sounds for the same things. Different languages have different sets of meanings. Okay? That's why you can say that a different language is a different way of thinking. Right? Different languages don't just have different sets of words, they have different sets of meanings. They have different ways of expressing things and thinking about things. The Russian language, I would say, is a language that is it's a language that is far less smooth than the English language. It's a far more prickly language. And what that conveys, and what that's able to convey, is that in the Russian language, you will have the ability to express certain kinds of emotions and concepts and ideas that you won't easily be able to express in English. And I might talk about that a little bit later when we get to the Russia section of this video. But I just want to start off and just mention that, because that's a huge factor in a lot of what we're seeing. But let me talk about comparative geopolitics in general. I strongly believe that in the concept of objective truth, and when there is a geopolitical incident, I do believe, for the purpose of dialectics, that there is a correct answer to whatever the geopolitical question is. There is a correct answer as to who's right and who's wrong for the purposes of analysis. That might not be obvious in the moment, and that might not be obvious to the teams that are playing, and that's obviously not going to be obvious to the soldiers who are fighting on their side. But the concept of just war exists, and the concept of geopolitical justice, justifiability exists. So there is such a thing as correct geopolitical analysis. But we have to qualify what that is and how to arrive at it. Obviously, which country you're from and what you know is going to influence and bias your sense as to what the objective reality of a situation is. It may bias things in ways that people aren't even aware of, and that's just kind of how that works. But that doesn't mean that there is no objective, correct, unbiased take that can be arrived at through, maybe it can't even be arrived at, but it at least exists with enough information, with enough cool-headed, I guess, clinical analysis, with enough neutrality and enough simply thinking about the principles at play. There is an objective standpoint from which you can answer the question which country is right and which country is wrong in a geopolitical conflict. In order to establish objectivity, you need to be informed about from a neutral perspective, you need to be informed about the histories of the countries involved, their cultures, their ways of thinking, but also just the experiential realities of the countries involved. And the experiential reality is the part that's most important, because understanding the experience of the two things is knowing what you're comparing and what's at stake. Like I was saying, a lot of people don't know the experiential reality of war, but they also just don't know the experiential difference between two countries. And that's not something that's easily conveyed by visiting a country either, right? You need to consume enough content, either have enough experience in a given country or consume enough content showing you that experience to understand the experiential reality of that country. Being at war, being under occupation by the Nazis may not be the same thing as being under occupation by the Japanese, which may not be the same thing as being under occupation by the Americans. These armies, these forces, they're different characters. They are different types of people. They are different types of mentalities in all sorts of ways. And that's something that needs to be carefully measured and analyzed in any kind of comparative geopolitical logic. Oh, that's another thing. Comparatively, when you're comparing the behaviors of two countries in questions regarding justice, you need to compare them from a neutral position, but you also need to compare them from a position where their behavior can be measured independently. Now, you don't want to get into arguments of saying, well, Russia did this because Ukraine did that, because Russia did that, because then you're bouncing back and forth and no one's taking responsibility. You want to measure things comparatively in a way where you can attribute responsibility to the country who you're measuring. So if, say, the Nazis killed 7 million Jews, or however many million Jews they killed, the argument is that you can't attribute that to the behavior of any other group besides the Nazis. That action is attributable to Nazi Germany and no one else besides Nazi Germany, at least basically no one else. And thus it is indicative of their character and who they are and the threat that the world would have faced given they had won or had they continued to win. So yeah, there's that. But yeah, this is like you can already imagine, if you're a thinking person, just how complicated this type of analysis is. Because you realize even in domestic policy debates regarding things like police violence, you can get into geopolitical comparison. When people compare, police statistics from other countries to America, and there it gets complicated. Right? Even there it's complicated. But here it's even more complicated because in geopolitics you have the behaviors of the governments and you have the interactions they have between one another on top of just domestic policy issues. So it's very complex. We do need to start thinking about it in a just way. And I think a lot of people don't think about it in terms of what is just geopolitically or what is just in military behavior in war. They think about it in terms of basic principles of what they value, basic principles of basic political ideals, so to speak. And political ideals are not enough. Political ideals are important in geopolitical comparison, but they're not enough because you also inevitably need to get into the question of how do you talk about justice between countries when they go to war with each other. And for that, you need to consult things like just war theory, which when I first heard of just war theory, I was like, it immediately spoke to me because I knew that this was something that would help defend certain Western countries from certain scrutiny in kind of political analysis. Because you have concepts like just ad bellum, just in bello, just post bellum, and you can compare different countries in their just ad bellum, just in bello, and just post bellum behavior. And I think that, for me, is the primary focus, at least with this Russia-Ukraine thing, and in arguments that I've been involved in, but also just my own thinking, when you talk about world stakes, at least for now, until we're in a situation where a world government exists or real international law exists, geopolitical comparison ends up being about comparing different countries' behavior before war, their justifiability of entering war, their just behavior during a war, and their just behavior after war or during occupation. Suffice it to say, and I'm going to say this right now, but on all three of those tiers, and this is a bold claim, I'll admit, but on all three of those tiers, a country like Russia is strictly worse than a country like America or the West. On all three of those levels, in both ad bellum, in bello, and post bellum. And I'm saying that based on my conception of what would be considered justice, which mostly, for argument's sake, is based on unjustifiable harm. Unjust behavior in war would be defined as causing unjustifiable harm. Now that's a bold claim, and that's not easy to prove because all the complexity, the things that I mentioned, but I'm just going to go over reasons and ways to think about this stuff to explain how, when you start actually comparing America's military behavior to other countries, it it ceases to be a situation where you can easily say that America is equal or even worse. And one of the things that bothers me the most about geopolitical comparison is how often it seems people just in reflexively use this argument of like, oh, well, America did it too. America did it too. Like, oh, they're raping women. Well, America did that too. America did that too. They've also murdered civilians. They've also raped women. They've also committed war crimes. Like a reflex, it just clicks. The second you hear about a country doing a bad thing, America's also doing it. This is the problem. You can't just reflexively equate these things. So much of what is incorrect geopolitical analysis is people falsely equating things that are probably very different, but feel the same or sound the same when you just look at them on paper. And the reason you assume they're the same is because you're assuming your own cultural linguistic context and imposing it on the information you're hearing. The reality that's experiential is actually quite different. If you were there when the Japanese were committing war crimes and you were there when the Americans were committing war crimes, you would probably feel different about the situation if you looked at it honestly. I know that's a bold claim, and I'm willing to be wrong about this because indeed I don't know all the details. But it's something that you need to at least consider such a possibility. Talking about the American-Japanese things right off the bat, I remember I even had an argument with people who are mostly pro-Ukraine in this situation, but they even said how when talking about Russian war crimes or war crimes of other nations, the reflex is America did it too. Now, here's the thing. This is the thing. Like, you are going to have instances, because all countries have bad actors and all countries do bad things, including the best countries on earth. All countries do bad things, and all countries that go to war commit war crimes. You can very easily just point fingers and make false equivalences. That's not the purpose of geopolitical analysis. The purpose is to actually compare the differences, because there are differences. Okay, and maybe this is my data and analyst brain talking, but there are KPIs you can look at just to see differences on a superficial level. Differences that cannot be chalked up to your nation's propaganda telling you how to think and avoiding mention. And even that's a fact too. Yes, every country, Russia and Japan and America, will all try to cover up their war crimes, but they'll do this to different degrees. They'll do this to varying and different degrees. Some of them will do this to less degrees than others. Some of these countries will hold their own war criminals to account better than others. I mean, my firm position, based on everything I've experienced and read, is that America, the American military, but also just America as a country, will hold its war criminals to a higher level of accountability than a country like Imperial Japan did, and also than a country like Russia. So the differences that we're talking about are not just in bello context of crimes happening. There's differences in the reaction to those crimes, in the reaction from officers when they hear about crimes and establishing military discipline, in the reaction of military courts and tribunals in punishing their own soldiers for committing crimes, in the level of government and social context and how people in society interpret those crimes, and so on and so forth. Just mentioning an issue like rape, because we've heard about the worst kinds of rapes happening in Ukraine now. I don't want to even get into the argument of how much I don't even want to get into this idea of how much I doubt the idea that the American military commits the same level of atrocities in the domain of rape as do other armies, as do countries like Japan and Russia. Russia, well, this is going to be around Russia, but I want to use Japan just as a basic example, because in arguments that I've gotten into, people say, well, yeah, the American army raped Japanese women in Okinawa, they raped Japanese women under occupation. But here's the fucking thing, guys, right? They rape Japanese women because there's monsters, and there's war criminals in the American military. Did they rape as many women as the Japanese did? When the Japanese occupied China, and the Philippines and Korea, did they rape as many women as the Japanese soldiers did? That's the question. Because when you put it like that, and this is the uncomfortable conversation people don't want to have, it may turn out that the character of the soldiers of one nation may actually have been different than the character of the soldiers of the other nation. The Americans did commit lots of rape, but they didn't commit the rape of Nanking. And if you want to look up the numbers on that, you can actually look it up just through some basic research. The Americans were committing, let's not talking totals, but just talk about the rate. The Americans were committing rape in Okinawa and Nanking have like similar size population totals, right? You know, it's both like around 1 million people, right? Americans raped 40 Japanese women a day. In Okinawa, the Japanese raped 476 women a day in Nanking. And that's the lower estimate. That's the lower estimate. That's an estimate. That's just basic math of the lower estimate of 20,000 women being raped over 6 weeks. The upper estimate is 80,000 women, which is 4 times that number, over 1,000 women a day. I mean, there's mass rape, and then there's literal, like a Holocaust level rape. Do you know what I mean? Like rape Holocaust. Like these are different things. You'd probably be safer as a Japanese civilian under American occupation than as a Chinese civilian under Japanese occupation. That's the point. And that's 40 women a day while they had brothels going too. I did look at a little bit of the details. While they had brothels going. Without brothels, it jumped to like maybe 300 women a day, which is still lower, but yeah, that's also quite a lot. So maybe I'm wrong about that in saying that there's this massive difference. Maybe it was actually similarly as bad, right? Not getting into any of the other war crimes that may have happened in Nanking. Maybe all of this stuff about Nanking is just exaggeration, right? Maybe there's misinformation on all sides, obviously. Who knows who's making up what for what reason. But my point is, and this isn't just, and I'm not just the only person who said this, there's historians who've looked at, the behavior of the American and Japanese armies and said even though the American soldiers did commit lots of rapes, they were still more disciplined on average than the Japanese soldiers and what they did abroad. And you would know this by looking at the rates. Now, this may sound like a very, like, technically gritty, annoying conversation. I mean, like, oh, Mr. Creamy, theoretical artist, why do you care about this? Because it matters. Because your experience as a civilian under American occupation is not going to be the same as your experience as a civilian under Japanese occupation. If it is the same, then fair game. Then we need to deal with the reality where those things are the same. But if they're not the same, if those experiences are different, that speaks to the character of the armies, and that speaks to the character of the situation. It tells you, essentially, whose side justice is on, more likely, right? That type of fact. Not getting into any other variable. It tells you something important about the situation and how you should think and feel about it. Obviously, no one should be committing war crimes in an ideal world. But if it's not an ideal world and it's a world of where we're trying to minimize harm by taking the best possible solution, then this question really does matter. In that situation, you go with the army that's the most disciplined and the most just and the most fair in its treatment of civilians. So, and the best thing to hear is to also compare, in order to do this, you need to really compare his war crime rates. War crime rates that cannot be attributed to orders or context, just rates. Because even total war crimes don't necessarily give you a clue as to what's happening, because different countries are involved in different amounts of wars. If you count all the wars America's been involved in, they've obviously killed more people. They've, in their wars than Japan, but that's because Japan was demilitarized and didn't get involved in wars, right? The reason rates matter more is because rates are what tell you the jus in bello behavior. Okay, getting involved in wars tells you the jus ad bellum behavior. It tells you the behavior of countries in their propensity to get into war. But even there, that's a different kind of argument. If you want to talk about a country's the number of people a country kills because it gets involved in war more, you have to now compare the reasons countries get involved in war. If this country that's getting involved in war a lot is doing it for justifiable reasons, in the sense of in the sense where justifiability is viewed as avoiding wars that would happen if they didn't get involved in war, then you have to do that comparison, and that comparison is also highly non-trivial. Yeah, but so this is the point, and I need to make this argument, because it's like it all comes down. Well, I'll talk about the character of nations later, but because I'm not done summarizing this point. Yeah, the point is volume doesn't equate to the amount of damage. Because again, like, just compare, the easiest comparison to make my point here is comparing America to Nazi Germany. Because any other comparison, you'll get into the weeds because people don't know enough about every situation, and they'll superficially judge things based on little bits and details here. But America versus the Nazis is the cleanest example of a justified war. Okay? If that's the cleanest example of a justified war, that's an example of where, imagine that America gets involved into war in order to suppress nations that would become like the Nazis. Well, then the fact that America has killed more people doesn't mean the same thing you think it does it? Because if they've been involved in war in order to avoid and suppress nations like Nazi Germany, obviously nations like America being involved in war is probably better than nations like Nazi Germany being involved in war. So total harm doesn't communicate the thing that's at stake in geopolitical analysis. And geopolitical analysis, it's not the total harm that was done by a country, it's the total harm that could be done theoretically by countries. When you look at the total harm done by America, you're not comparing it to anything. Most people that look at the amount of atrocities and harms done by America aren't comparing them to anything. They're just looking at the harm and comparing them to an ideal world where the harm should be zero. Well, no shit. If you just take this kind of naive, pacifistic, position, this presume pacifism to be the ideal that you should compare things to. Pacifism can be the ideal, but pacifism can't be the ideal you compare things to. Because you're never comparing a situation where if pacifism is what you're comparing things to, that's a situation of if America didn't go to war, that number of atrocities on Earth would be zero. You don't know that. What you're comparing things to is the harm done by America to the potential harm that could be done or would be done by another empire, like Nazi Germany, if they had the power of America. And those numbers are not going to be the same. They're not going to be the same. It's very unlikely because they're influenced by the characteristics of the empires and the nations. A great example of this type of comparison is the American war in Afghanistan and the Soviet war in Afghanistan. If you compare these two wars, even at a superficial level, you can clearly see that the Soviet-Afghan war was way worse than the American-Afghan war. The Soviet war in Afghanistan, you can just look at a population graph of Afghanistan and watch what happens to it during the Soviet-Afghan war. It drops by like 10%, whereas during the American-Afghan war, it doesn't drop at all. I think that I even saw a stat somewhere where they killed like 1/5 of fighting age men in Afghanistan. The Soviet-Afghan war was brutal, enormously brutal. The Soviet-Afghan war, in terms of, again, rough estimates on numbers, you can go from 500,000 civilians killed, not combatants, civilians, to 2 million. That's an estimate of the number of civilians killed in the Soviet-Afghan war. The American-Afghan war, it's around 50,000 civilians. Now, if you want to compare those numbers, you also have to keep in mind that the American-Afghan war lasted twice as long as the Soviet-Afghan war. The Soviet-Afghan war lasted 9 years. The American-Afghan war lasted 20 years. So what that is, mathematically, is a civilian death rate, a civilian casualty rate that's 20 times as large, right? 20 times as large. Yeah, it would be 20 times because the lower estimate is 500,000 versus 50,000. That's 10 times more people in half the time. That's huge. Now, you could attribute that to all sorts of things. I heard an argument attributing that to the fact that the technology was worse, and that because of drone strikes and stuff, that actually drone strikes lower the casualty rates of civilians. That could be true. It could be that if America had been involved in Afghanistan in the 80s, the death rate would have been similar. But here's the thing. This is when we get to my other assumption, that I'm still quite confident that the death rate would be lower, because some of the things that the Soviet soldiers would do are probably things that American soldiers wouldn't even think to do. Yeah, but again, this is a discussion, and it's a discussion that just goes beyond any even basic complexities that I'm getting into now. This is a discussion that's very complicated. I wish people would take it more seriously, but what it feels like people do is they just want to dismiss it and stick to their narrative. And I know that they want to dismiss it because they're not divulging important details when I ask for details in these discussions. People will bring up the amount of death that, France killed 5 million Algerian people, Algerian civilians over the course of, French colonization of Algeria. What they don't even mention is that that's 200 years of history. And when I start looking into the details, I'm like, well, they killed this many civilians over the course of the entire history of colonial Algeria, right? That's an important thing to mention in a conversation where we're comparing, the West to the USSR, right? So these comparisons are tricky, and I admit my analysis of the Soviet-Afghan War versus American-Afghan War, or even America versus Japan, may be off. It may be off, but it's the kind of thing where the more details I look at, the more details I look at, I'm not thrown off from my narrative. I'm more convinced of my narrative, is what happens. And this gets into a point of why do these comparisons matter? Because they speak to the character of nations. They speak to the character of nations. And the character of nations is what we're really talking about when we're talking about geopolitical comparison, right? We look at these rates to compare the characters of the nations to know who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. It's a simple type of moral calculus where we're basically reducing a nation to an individual and thinking like, well, if America was a man and Russia was a man, which man is worse? I mean, I know what the answer is, but that's the type of logic that this is. And in order to know the character of nations, the only difference between the character of nation and the character of people is that a character of nation is way more complex than the character of an individual. Like you getting into all of these little, like all the things I mentioned, right? Cultures, language, ideologies, philosophies, all those things matter in the comparison of the character of nations. I think the problem with a lot of realist analysts is that they think that the characters of nations are all the same. It's kind of how like classical economics works in producing that. They think the characters of all consumers and people in the economy is the same. That you can reduce everyone to just a simple set of self-interest. And there are self-interest, and there is, there are basic interests that are the same across characters, but that doesn't mean there's no difference in character. You need the concept of difference in character to have moral calculus in the first place, because if there's no difference in characters, there's no difference in right and wrong either. No one ever does wrong because everyone's the same, right? So here's where a good time for me to talk about language comparisons. And talking about the difference between Russia and America, language is one of the things you can look at. The Russian language is far more prickly and coarse than the English language. Some people would think that is subjective and that's not a leap to the character, but I think it's absolutely and at least partially related to character. The Russian language is able to be far more beautiful than the American language, but it's also able to be far more ugly. And the thing about this specific of the language is that you can see even in the language has this ability to express foulness far more easily than than English language does. In English, if you want to express a truly deep concept, or not even say deep concept, but if you want to express a deep feeling, let's put it like that, you need to use a lot of words. You need to use a lot of comparisons. You need to use a lot of terms, and which is something English is built for. English has a lot of unique words. It's a very complex language in terms of the number of words in it. You need to be very verbose to express a complex idea or a deep feeling. In Russian, a deep feeling is conveyed like this. You don't need a lot of work to express a deep feeling. A deep feeling of hatred is something you can convey very easily. And one of the ways that this happens is that large words are abbreviated to express a very simple concept and in a snappy way. Right, and that snappiness is what makes it a deeper feeling. If you want to be very hateful, snapping is how you do it. Talking in a very sort of aggressive, snappy way, right? So a lot of like racial slurs or hateful terms are invented and constructed as words that are trying to be like snappy. In the Russian language, there's a racial slur which doesn't exist in English at all. There's a racial slur for all national minorities, for all minorities at once. That doesn't exist in America. You don't have a racial slur for everyone. You have a racial slur for black people, for Asian people, for Hispanics, and so on, but you don't have a slur for all minorities. But in Russian, you do. And that slur is natsmin, naциональное меньшинство, which is... It's natsmin is short for национальное меньшинство, which literally translates to national minority. The equivalent in English would be nashmin. Right? So nashmin is a racial slur in Russian. Right? That's an example of this. Right? But there's also other examples in which the Russian language expresses feelings in a deeper, stronger way than in English. There's lots of different examples that I come up with, but they're not entering my head right now. Well, there's an example like, cannon fodder. The word cannon fodder in English is cannon fodder. In Russian, it's пушечное мясо, which means cannon meat. Now, you wouldn't say cannon meat in English. That would sound kind of stupid, but it's also kind of more gross if you think it. You don't think of people as meat, but in Russian, it's cannon meat. Then there's examples like atrocity. The word atrocity, it's a separate word for some sort of hideous crime. In Russian, the word is zverstvo, which doesn't actually literally mean atrocity, because the word zverstvo comes from the word zver, which means beast. So the word zverstvo means something like bestiality. It means like beast-like behavior. And it's not a separate term like atrocity. This is an example of these are some basic examples of how I think English smooths things out. The Russian language does not smooth things out. It makes things snappy, prickly, and just hot to the touch. It's a very, very... It's both it can be a very beautiful language, but it's also a very crude language. And that also speaks to the character of the nation. Yeah, that's my point about language. But I want to say more stuff about characters. That the reason character matters is it matters when you make these equivalencies, right? When you think about something that Russia does and equate it to something that America does, what you're not realizing is the differences in characters and how those decisions are made and the thought process and everything that's going on. Knowing two different countries allows you to know the characters better. There's a reason why a lot of people who compare Russia's behavior with Ukraine similar to say the Cuban Missile Crisis, or what would America do if Canada had missiles set up by China to aim at America. This is where we get into our lovely little friend John Mearsheimer, who makes all of these silly little comparisons between, Russia's response to NATO with America's response to the Soviet Union. This is an example of someone who just doesn't understand the difference in the characters of things. Just completely misunderstands the character of these events. This is why I talk about character. Character of the two countries and how they make these decisions and their goals makes every single thing in the equation different. Mearsheimer's doing this not because he's a propagandist. He's doing this because he has a simplified political worldview called offensive realism, where basically all nations are the same and they're all equal in their self-interest, and his model of realism basically posits that the way they do things is the same. My version of realism posits that different nations are not the same. They're actually very different. They're everything they do and think is different because they have different cultures, different philosophies, different identities. The difference of the identity defines the difference in their behavior and character as well. What you're looking at when you're looking at similarities is you're looking at the superficial actions rather than the forces that guide those actions. Like, yes, all countries do wars, all countries have economic interests, all countries have geopolitical interests, all countries act self-interestedly to a degree, right? All countries have these, and yes, if the Soviet Union is putting missiles near America, America will have a problem with that, just as Russia will have a problem if America's putting missiles near Russia. But that's not enough, you see. The fact that you're looking at these kinds of elements of behavior and saying they're the same, you're not actually looking at the true behavior. You're looking at elements of the behavior. Yes, there are elements in which Russia is a rational country, just like America, and also cares about missiles on its borders and everything. But that's not what Russia and who Russia is and how they're doing things. That's just an element of what they do, which is the same. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a situation that I don't know as much about the specifics, but I mean, in general, when you want to compare America imposing a threat on Russia or Russia imposing a threat on America, the difference is stark from the beginning, because what America would do to Russia is not the same as what Russia would do to America if they were to somehow invade it. Okay? Second of all, the relationship between Cuba and America is very different than the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. I don't know everything about Cuban and American history, but I have a feeling that there isn't a long-standing antagonism and a desire for America to somehow possess and own Cuba as a nation. America's relationship with Cuba is going to be one mostly based on the desire to trade and have some type of capitalistic relationship going. And Cuba wanted to be against that, right, when they had their little revolution and then saw favor with the Soviet Union. There you see the parallels in the situation. But the difference is that even in those similarities, I don't think that what America wanted from Cuba and what America would have, in theory, done to Cuba would have been the same as what Russia wants for Ukraine. Like, that's the difference. That's why it's not just a matter of putting missiles there, right? Or the Soviet Union putting missiles in Cuba. Also, just to get into this conversation in more specificity, America has not put missiles. Like, NATO expansion is not the same thing as missiles on Russia's border, because the nuclear missiles that are, as far as I know, the nuclear missiles that are in NATO have not moved an inch further east from where they were in West Germany. New NATO members do not have American missiles aimed at Russia, right? NATO expanded, but missiles did not expand. That's one thing. The second thing here is, of course, the whole thing is that NATO is a defensive alliance, not an aggressive alliance, which I know people are going to but that is also a fact in this situation. But yeah, the whole thing with Cuba is that I don't think that the relationship with Cuba and America was as hostile before, the altercation happened that led Cuba to becoming communist. I don't think it ultimately would be as hostile after, even though there's still a embargo. The ultimate goal that America has for Cuba is nothing is nothing as savage as the goal that Russia has for Ukraine. America likely just disagrees with the Cuban government and doesn't like their government, but they don't have this idea of imposing against the Cuban culture. I'm saying that like vaguely, but I just like knowing how America works, and I'm sure people will argue against that point, but knowing how America works, I doubt America has the same interests, both leading up to the event and after, as does Russia's interest with Ukraine. But that's not even the Cuban example is more similar to the Russia-Ukraine thing. The example that's completely off the charts in stupidity is the example of Canada, which Mearsheimer also uses. The example of Canada setting up missiles to aim at the U.S. is ridiculous. It's so completely different from Russia-Ukraine for the simple reason that Canada's relationship with America is completely and utterly different than Ukraine's relationship with Russia. And this one I can speak to because I actually know the history there far better than the history of Cuba. Canada and America are allies, and they're perfectly happy being allies, and their allyship is based on free, liberal association. They don't hate each other, and there's no threat. Like, neither country has a hatred to subsume the culture of the other. They bicker and fight and disagree and have all sorts of, perhaps even toxic tendencies here and there. But there isn't this wholesale. This is something I'm going to talk about in the Russia character section, but they don't. Canada doesn't fear that America's going to invade Canada. Like, it's just that's just not a thing. If America doesn't want to invade Canada, other than in some stupid memes. But there's no, even though the parallels are there in terms of cultural similarity. Ukrainian culture, a lot of it is, kind of has been historically Russified and is tied to the history of Russia here and there, and Kievan Rus and all that. But it's not the same as the history of. The point is there's parallels between the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, just as there's parallels between the culture of Canada and America. Yet, despite those cultural parallels, there's no threat of imposing against the freedom of the other from America to Canada. The relationship between Canada and America would have to deteriorate for decades and decades before Canada would even think of becoming a base for China or Russia to set up missiles against America. That's why I hate that comparison. It's such a stupid comparison, yet it does exactly what a misinforming narrative does, is it activates the fear center in the minds of conservative people and gets them to think, holy shit, yeah, we wouldn't want that. We wouldn't want Russia to threaten us. We shouldn't threaten Russia. We shouldn't threaten Russia because that's the same thing as them threatening us with Canada. It's not the same thing. The reason you feel it's the same thing is because you feel how dangerous it would be if Canada were suddenly our enemy. You would not feel this way if America did things to harass Canada for years and years and had this recent history where Canada had never even been independent, as a nation. And Americans had this belief that, Canada shouldn't be a country. You wouldn't feel the same way about it in that situation. The reason American conservatives, or reactionary, the reason that Mearsheimer comparison landed for them is because they thought it was the same. This is why I'm talking about the character of nations and situations. It's because it's not the same. Canada does not treat or want from Canada what Russia wants from Ukraine. There would have to be so many things different about the relationship in order to make it an analogous situation. America would have to abuse Canada and threaten Canada aggressively over and over again for Canada to go and seek favor for a country like China. That's why Mearsheimer's a fucking dipshit. And when he makes this comparison, is he doesn't fucking understand the first thing about how people in the country think and what context, what cultural context they're dealing with, and how that cultural context affects the political context. The other thing is, in terms of, the last point on the comparative geopolitics things is the experiential comparison. I talked about experiential reality briefly earlier. This is an example of where I'm going to cite our good buddy Chomsky, who is honestly dead to me, because his takes on this situation have not simply been bad, they have been so bad that it's at a point where I basically think that Chomsky shouldn't even be taken seriously on any geopolitical commentary he makes and on any foreign policy, because it's clear that his worldview is limited to everything in the world is okay, only America is the source of harm and violence. That is literally his worldview. That is his only thought. And the reason that's his thought is likely because he's doing that thing I mentioned where he's He's comparing all the crimes of America to the ideal where the crimes should be zero, rather than to what ends up happening if America stops getting involved in the world and what other countries do get involved. To know that Chomsky fails to understand the different, like a lot of people have critiqued Chomsky's take on this, and I'm not going to go into too much detail. I just started noticing various ways in which Chomsky makes evaluative statements that he says are obvious, that he acts as if they're obvious. And I started noticing him doing this, and I notice him doing this all the time now, to the point where I'm actually at a point where I don't think he should be taken seriously. He makes evaluative statements that are actually incredibly hard to justify and prove, but he says them as if it's clear that they're true, as if he's researched all the researched and talked to all the experts and he's studied for years to figure out that his evaluative statements are just an accurate description of reality. Let me give you one of Chomsky's comparative statements. When he was asked to critique, Russia, he compared Russia to America. He said, yeah, Russia went to Chechnya and they committed war crimes there, but that's nothing compared to what America did in Iraq. Okay, note there. And then he goes on in this one interview to talk about America does the worst tortures in Guantanamo Bay. The worst tortures. These are the words that Chomsky uses. Worst tortures. Now, I don't know what tortures they do in Guantanamo Bay that they don't tell us about, but the main tortures that we hear about are waterboarding, force feeding, sleep deprivation, beating. None of these tortures necessarily involve permanently maiming a person, permanently disabling a part of their body or killing them. Now, if you know anything about the kind of tortures that the FSB does, this claim of the worst tortures is beyond fucking ridiculous. And I'm not trying to say that the tortures that they do aren't bad, but the worst tortures. I'm specifically targeting that word worst. They're not the worst tortures. Like in the FSB, they literally skin people alive. They peel back the skin on people's fingers. They castrate people. They stick barbed wire up people's asses and pull it out, tearing their colon apart. If you want to talk about America doing shit like that, by all means. America maybe does shit like that at CIA black sites in Egypt and other countries and shit. Or maybe America does shit like that, not directly, but through their proxies. Okay, that's a comparison. That's still different because that's a degree removed. But he talked about Guantanamo Bay being the worst tortures. There's no fucking way that Guantanamo Bay has the worst tortures of all the shit that happens on this planet. The fact that those words slipped his mouth just shows how he lives in a fucking cave where the only problems in the world are America, and has almost just a vulgar lack of experiential knowledge of how horrible and brutal parts of this planet are, how truly evil people on this planet are, to the point where if you think waterboarding is the worst tortures, maybe he's using it as a category. The waterboarder belongs to the list of the worst tortures. Oh yeah, solitary confinement. But even that, those things are not close to the worst. Like even they may be horrible, and they may go beyond a threshold of harm that is unacceptable, but they don't involve, they're not medieval fucking tortures. Like, they're not medieval. My friend, if you want to talk about Russia, the kinds of tortures Russia does are likely medieval. And we're not even talking about the FSB. We're talking about the tortures that their own soldiers might do, as being ordered to do. Like driving over people's legs and stuff, just on a casual basis. I mean, this is just ridiculous. Chomsky's take is generally bad. Chomsky literally thinks that Ukrainians want the war to end at this point. He thinks that Ukrainians want to negotiate with Putin, and that it's America that's not allowing them to do so. Which is another take of I don't know what cave you live in, because Not a single Ukrainian that I've spoken to says that. In fact, if you pay attention to the Ukrainian media, and the American and the UK media, the media that is the most anti-Russian, the most anti-negotiation is the Ukrainian media. Every time some article comes out in America, in the New York Times, or some fucking Biden saying, anyone in the West, France, Germany, talking about how we should negotiate with Putin, there's always an article or a statement or something that comes out from the Ukrainians where they're like, fuck no, we do not want to negotiate. Or rather that if it's media personnel talking about why negotiation right now is a bad idea. It's just like, I honestly think like it's either he's listening to Russian propaganda or he's listening to Ukrainians who say they want the war to end. But Ukrainians who say they want the war to end, that's Ukrainians expressing their wishful thinking. Their wish is for the war to end. That's not them talking about what they think the solution is. Which Ukrainian seriously thinks the solution to the problem is negotiating with Putin? If you listen to people like Alexei Arestovich, who's an advisor to Zelensky, who does daily briefings on the war, they all talk about how, listen, if you have a peace agreement now with neutrality, it'll just be violated 10 years down the road, and we're going to be in the same situation again. That's all that's going to happen. There's already been 2 peace agreements that were violated. There's just going to be another violation. It only kicks the problem down the road. And Russia's shown their hand by trying to invade every major city at once. So we know that they would want to go and take all of Ukraine. They're not going to sit there with Ukraine being neutral and just sit by and do nothing. They're just going to wait, buy their time and wait for the moment where they can go again. Every Ukrainian fucking knows this. No Ukrainian is sitting there thinking that we need to give up some land and then this will go away. Chomsky must actually be out of his fucking mind. I could rant about Chomsky for so long. I mean, it's just like, it's ridiculous. Unless he's suggesting that the Americans are telling the Ukrainians what to say and they're telling them that they need to be this aggressive, which is hard to believe, right? Because even if that's true, evidence, please. The Ukrainians, because it's just not my experience. I'm Ukrainian. I listen to Ukrainians talk. Ukrainians that are in Ukraine, right? Ukrainians that are in America and in Canada, and I talk, and they all say like, no, I mean, they wish for the war to end, but they don't think that that negotiating will solve anything. They all think that the problem is you can't negotiate. They all think you basically cannot negotiate with Russia. Negotiations aren't a real thing in a country like Russia. They think negotiations are just used to push for the next moment that they can take as much land as they want. That's how Ukrainians see it. Their wishful thinking that the war should end is not the same thing as them legitimately wanting. See, it's like if the BBC or some other publication puts out an article that says Zelensky says he's willing to talk to Putin, people in America get the idea like, oh, Zelensky wants the war to end. Oh, okay, the Ukrainians want the war to end. And they don't understand the cultural context. When Zelensky says he's willing to talk to Putin, that doesn't mean that Ukraine wants to stop the war and not take back all of their land. That's not what that means. This is one example of knowing the context of the two countries. When Zelensky says he's willing to talk to Putin, what that means is he's trying to do 2 things. Either he's trying to show to the Russian establishment that we're not afraid of you, we're equal, because Putin doesn't want to talk to Zelensky. Putin doesn't want to talk to Zelensky. He wants to divide up and carve up Ukraine like Stalin did with Hitler with Poland. And number 2, he's trying to show that he's acting in good faith. He's not actually interested in negotiating and giving up, the captured territories like Kherson right now. That is not happening. And I know this from saying is like the people who want this war to be won by Ukraine, where winning is taking back every piece of land, are the Ukrainians themselves. And you have to literally be out of your mind to think that like countries like Russia and Ukraine, the conflicts they deal with are conflicts that just get negotiated away. Like these are all Everyone's a reasonable actor except America. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about Chomsky. It's just we're already, how long? We're already an hour into this video, and I'm only done my first section, but Jesus Christ. Chomsky's takes have been abysmal. Okay. Next section, the nature of Russia's character. So, I've already been speaking as if I know the nature of Russia's character and that it's enough to be on the pro-Ukraine side of this argument pretty much completely, but there's a lot of arguments you can get into trying to explain Russia's character and how it works and what it is, and there's a lot of arguments you could get into with Russian nationalists as well as conservative reactionaries in the West who seem to have a very, very romanticized idea of Russia, is all I can say, as well as the far left who are out of their mind when it comes to Russia. There's a lot of arguments you can get into, a lot of arguments. I'm going to try and simplify them to one main argument that explains Russia's character in this particular conflict without getting into too much broad, historical detail. I'm going to try to explain the problem, how this problem stems from Russia's character. The problem with Russia's character is not that Russia lies. It's not that simple. I think the Russian government lies directly, but the Russian people don't so much. Well, maybe they lie as well, but I think what psychologically motivates them is not lying, it's denying reality. Denying reality is what they do because they have to deny reality in their own lives because their own lives are sufficiently miserable. The other thing is the amount of criminality that's in place in the Russian world means you have to basically deny things in order to stay safe, so you don't get caught from all the shit that you're stealing. But no, we're not going to get into that. Like, you want to talk about the arguments with the Russian nationalists. Russian nationalists will bring up a lot of different points of contention. They'll talk about the Azov battalion. They'll talk about the far-right parties like Svoboda. They'll talk about NATO expansion. They talk about Ukraine having the same culture as Russia and that the people in Ukraine are just Russians. And they have a lot of different arguments. A lot of detailed arguments about why Russia's not actually the bad guy in this situation, etc., etc. Here's the main problem. It doesn't actually matter. Even though there's many ways of countering every single point they make by just either showing how Russia also does the thing that they're accusing Ukraine of worse, or that the things that they're complaining about, like the Azov battalion, don't seem to be that big of a problem. The bigger issue, beyond any of those things that I've identified, is that those things actually don't matter at all, because those are all talking points that people come up with to justify what they really care about. What they fundamentally believe is that Ukraine is not a country. And the reason you know this is just by taking a very careful step back, forget about the Azov battalion, forget about the Wagner group, forget about war crimes here and there and ethnic Russians and all this, and just think about the dialectical logic itself. Under no circumstances can Nazism be equated with a desire for self-determination. These two things, like Nazism and self-determination, are not equal things. They cannot even be equated. A country wanting to be independent cannot be Nazi. To equate those things is insane, because it effectively means any country that wants independence is now Nazis and therefore evil and therefore can't be independent. It means you can't have self-determination, you can't have independence, everything has to be owned by the single one empire, the single Russian Empire. Why do I bring up that these things are unequal? Because even if Ukraine was a Nazi country, even if everyone was a Nazi, even if the entire nationalist movement of Ukraine was full of Nazis, even if Ukrainian culture was identical to Russian culture, even if all of their talking points were true, so what? The dialectical division here is not about Nazism the versus anti-Nazism. It's an issue of independence versus dependence. The point being what? The point being is that even if Ukraine was all of these terrible things to Russia that Russia's claiming, so what? You can imagine a reality where that's just not the case. Where, okay, what if Ukraine was not, full of Nazis and was not a threat to Russia and all these things? What if Ukraine was just a group of ethnic Russians that wanted independence? What then? Present that option for them, even if it's the case. Because this is how the dialectic works, right? You need to understand that the talking point about Nazis has no bearing whatsoever on the concept of independence. If a group of people want independence, you can't just call them Nazis to not give them independence. That's fucking obscene, right? That's insane. So when you're arguing with Russian nationalists, you should ask them whether they believe in the concept of independence itself. Independence of Ukraine from Russia. Forgetting all the Nazi shit. And if you bring that example up, you say, okay, let's say Ukraine wasn't Nazi, there was no Azov battalion, there was no fucking NATO, none of this stuff mattered. Would they accept Ukraine's independence from Russia? And watch them fight tooth and nail and grasp at every straw imaginable to avoid answering that question. That's what's going to happen when you bring that up to a Russian nationalist. No Russian nationalist is going to sit there and entertain the mere idea of Ukraine being an independent country, regardless of whether there's Nazis involved or not, or Azov involved or not, or NATO involved or not. And that's the point. That's how we know this has nothing to do with any of those things. Because when you argue with a Russian nationalists over and over again, and there's no counter examples to this, they will avoid confronting any reality where Ukraine could just be an independent country on its own. They will avoid trying to answer this question. Because it's the thing, right? If you believe in the concept of self-determination, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter that the cultures are the same in Russia and Ukraine, which they're not, actually. It shouldn't matter that their histories are the same, which they're also not, by the way. Or that their languages are the same, which they're also not. It shouldn't matter that they're the same, even if they're completely the same. Why can't one country freely decide, or one region of people freely decide, hey, we want to be our own people. We don't want to have anything to do with you. The concept itself, that's the concept of self-determination. If you ask people to entertain that hypothetical, a normal person will say, well, yeah, of course. If there's no Nazis or anything involved, there's no threat to Russia, who cares? It's totally fine. But you're not dealing with normal people when you're dealing with Russian nationalists. Maybe normal people in the West will give that answer. That's somehow by Russia's, angle in this whole debate. But Russian nationalists will not give you a straight answer. They will try to avoid answering that question. There's no way to justify affirming self-determination with invading a country. There's no, without assuming that self-determination equals self-determination in favor of the country whose autocratic rule you support. By this logic, the only self-determination that can exist is the self-determination of your empire and nothing else. Okay? This is so basic that it defies some sort of logic. Because once you get into this dialectic with Russian nationalists, you start to realize that the denial of Ukraine's independence is conceptual, not practical. It's not an issue of, well, yes, Ukraine's, nationalism and Ukraine's independence from Russia is acceptable in theory, but we don't accept it for reasons A, B, and C, because the Azov battalion, because there's Nazis, because of American influence, yada, yada. No. That would be an actual argument. If the independence of Ukraine was being denied on a basis of practical application, on a basis of, applicable, practical, pragmatic factors. Because on those factors, you can always deny independence. Quebec may want independence from the rest of Canada, but we wouldn't accept it for all sorts of reasons. Texas may want independence from America. We wouldn't accept for all sorts of practical reasons. But no one in Canada or America will deny the notion of Quebec or Texas independence on the basis that they're not allowed to have it in principle. But in Russia, Russian nationalists, denial of Ukrainian independence is a principled denial. They deny the independence of Ukraine conceptually. Americans, Canadians, we're not going to deny the independence of Quebec and Texas conceptually. The other thing is these people also probably don't even realize that they deny the independence conceptually. They have no clue that it's a conceptual denial because they're not even aware of what a conceptual affirmation of self-determination would even look like. They're not aware that it's conceptual, but it is conceptual. And you can see that when you argue with them. You can see that by virtue of that's the thing they're not saying. And if you try to get them to say it, they won't. Because to the rational brain, self-determination of a country should always be fair game. It should always be fair game, but it's not fair game. Obviously, the people who are against it are never going to openly say that they're against it, but they are going to deny it but they are denying it in their head, basically, through the implicit logic of how they avoid confronting the hypothetical reality of an independent Ukraine that's allowable. Because they don't want independence that way. They want an independence where all the independent nations are still somehow affirming of and loyal to Russia. Last time I was in Ukraine, which was in 2014, there was an old man in the park who said, we were talking about the war in the Donbass that was just breaking up, like me and my mom. And then this guy in the park said, "Украина такой страны нет." And he said it angrily. He didn't just say it like, well, he didn't say it super angrily, but he didn't say, "Украина такой страны нет." You know, he said it with like a jab, like he was, poking a knife into my chest a little bit. Такой страны нет. And what that means is, well, the way a translator, an interpreter would translate it, they'd probably translate this as Ukraine, this country does not exist, or there is no such thing as Ukraine, or there is no country, or Ukraine is no country. Although the literal translation, if you just look at all the words, is Ukraine, this country, no. Like, that's the literal meaning of every word that he used. Ukraine, this country, no. And that's way more powerful, and it's one of the reasons I think the Russian language is so powerful. Because with that statement, he's not just conveying like all the conditional denials of Ukraine. Ukraine's never been a country. The idea that Ukraine's never been a country, is presently not a country, and in the future won't be a country, but also that it shouldn't be a country, all at once. All in that one statement, this country, no. This country, no, is the belief of Russian nationalists. They don't have another belief motivating them. Every other thing they say, every other talking point they have is set up after the fact to reverse justify the initial belief of Ukraine, this country, no. That's what they actually think. With basically no exceptions. I've yet to meet a Russian nationalist that doesn't think that. And here's the actual thing. Even the concept of Ukraine being part of the Russian Empire, the Pan-Slavic Empire, is not even an unacceptable concept. That's another thing. If you want, it's perfectly possible to have Ukraine and Belarus and Russia all be part of the great Rus. It's fair game. The concept is fine. You can have that. But you can't achieve it by simply forcing it. You can't achieve it by denying the concept of the alternative. That's why there's a fucking. That's why you know that there's a philosophical problem here. You can have your concept, but you can't have it by fundamentally denying another concept. You cannot fucking deny concepts. All concepts have to be believed in the affirmative. You can deny the application of certain concepts, but you cannot deny the idea itself. The idea of an independent Ukraine or a Pan-Slavic empire are both valid ideas. The application is what's invalid. But we know the application of the Pan-Slavic empire is invalid because the people in the Pan-Slavic empire are the originators of the initial conceptual denial, where they deny the idea of an independent Ukraine. You can't have a Pan-Slavic empire with these people. You can't have an empire with these people because they don't believe in a basic tenet of self-determination independence to begin with. And it's funny because they still use the concept of self-determination, but they only use self-determination to further the narrative where the self-determination equals the self-determination of their empire that wants to own more and more land. The problem is the reason it's hard for people to get this level of depth and understanding Russia's position is because the logic isn't in what people say, it's in what they don't say. Russia's hard for people to understand because they don't actually say what they believe, right? What they actually believe in is present in what they do, and they don't say it either because they're taught to deny openly saying what they want on the one front, and the other front they may not even be aware of it. They may literally think that wanting, self-determination equaling Ukraine being part of Russia is the natural form of self-determination, which is a completely twisted and skewed notion of what self-determination actually means. The nature of Russia's character is a character where Russia is it's a harsh, depraved, miserable country with misery all around, but it's a character which affirms the misery. The nature of Russia is hard for people to get because Russia is paradoxical. Russia is a place that is harsh and miserable, but they like the misery. Rather than wishing themselves to be less miserable, they have a mindset of affirming their own misery and wanting to spread it. That's the character of Russia. That's the character of how this type of imperialism works. And it's very counterintuitive because it's not usually how imperialism works. This attitude, which is paradoxical, combined with their denial of realities, what makes it hard for the West to understand how Russia works. That's why they constantly take things Russia says at face value. They say, oh, well, Russia's talking about NATO. Clearly that's a threat to them. Russia doesn't have to care about threats of NATO, right? Russian culture has so many problems internally beyond just NATO. America's not a threat to Russia, not at least through NATO, but not in any sort of sense that it's worth them even caring about. American realists again misinterpret this and assume that Russia's mentality in fearing American aggression is somehow rational. They think this because they don't realize how bound in irrationality it is. It would be rational for a normal country to fear aggression. It's not rational for a country that seeks to perpetuate misery to fear aggression, because a normal country would seek to end its own problems and improve itself. And of course, the door is open in the West to allow that possibility. The door could always be open for that. All you have to do is try and get along with people. But Russia fundamentally does not want to, because Russia has this attitude of affirming its empire while affirming its misery at the same time. They don't want to be an equal. They don't even want to be a partner. They don't even want to be a partner that's better than other partners. They simply want to be the head of the table. And they want this so badly that they don't care how miserable their own people and their own nation is in the process. The attitude I liken it to is that the difference between Russia and America is that, or not even just Russia, but the difference between Russia and the West is that the West justifies imperialism or justifies owning something by believing itself to be better than whoever they're targeting. Russia justifies ownership by assuming that it already exists. Okay? Russia assumes essentially things belong to Russia. It assumes things belong to them and then starts from that assumption, works backwards to argue that in favor of their interests starting from that assumption. Rather than justifying ownership through some type of merit, they assume ownership and then justify it through dismerit. It's a very weird mentality, is all I'm trying to say. It's a very weird mentality that I don't think any American fully gets until I don't even know if anyone really gets it. It's something you just need to spend enough time thinking about to get how it actually works. But what people need to understand is that it's not a reality, it's a mentality. When Russia acts like it owns Crimea, or that it owns Ukraine or some other piece of land, they're not doing it because they actually have a real reason to do it. They're doing it because it's a mentality of ownership. They assume ownership before doing anything. They assume ownership by virtue of, they implicitly just assume we should own this. And the act of coming into possession of it follows the assumption that they already somehow own it and that it was taken from them. That's how Russian imperialism works. It's hard to this is why it's hard to explain this shit with experiential reality, and the only real way to explain it is by just getting into examples of concepts. But this is my point, is like Russia, if you look at Russia's behavior from a position where Russia assumes ownership before doing things, a lot of the things that Russia does start to make perfect sense. A lot of the things that they do that seem completely unfair fit in perfectly in that conception of the world, where we assume we're right because we are, right? So anything we do that follows is in reaction to us trying to defend ourselves from our righteousness being denied to us by the rest of the world. It's simultaneously ultra imperialistic, but also ultra self-victimizing at the same time. It's like a permanent, we're the victims, which is why we're the bullies. Like, it's that type of attitude. I have a random example written here about Russia's attitude about how Russia's attitude towards the unfairness of things. You can get into a lot of different examples of this if you just look at like Soviet history and stuff, but during all the crazy repressions that were happening under Stalin, you have all sorts of weird stories that come out, stories that would actually just be unheard of. This is the thing. It's like Westerners think they've heard about injustice because they live in the West and they know about Western colonialism. The thing is, they can't imagine this type of injustice because it fundamentally defies logic. So under Stalin's repression, you can get into lots of stories, but one of the stories that I have written here is about a situation where time that there's a repression where there's college students that are making a joke about Stalin, and the NKVD comes to arrest them. Now you already think like, oh, well, that's already, free speech, bye-bye, right? You're arresting people over a joke. But it's worse than that. They heard that someone made a joke. So what do is they interrogate all the students. The students that told the joke, the student that told the joke denied it. And most of the students that talked about the joke denied it. But two of the students who did not tell the joke but heard it told the interrogators that they heard the joke. So who do the interrogators go after? Who do they arrest? Now you might think to yourself, if you're a Westerner, well, they would probably they'd probably go after the Bob who was snitched on, right? They had snitches telling the NKVD that Bob told the joke, right? That's the right, because that's what would make sense, right? That would make sense. They'd go after the people who are accused of wrongthink, because you don't want to have wrongthink in your society. They're going after the wrong thinkers, clearly, right? No, wrong. They didn't arrest Bob who told the joke. They arrested the two students who told the interrogators that they heard the joke and left everybody else who denied it alone. That's how the NKVD did. Interesting, isn't it? You might think to yourself, it just defies logic. It defies logic completely. And it doesn't defy logic. The logic that they're using is that they simply need to suppress mention of the joke at all. By arresting the people who admitted to the joke, they essentially get rid of the evidence that the joke even happened, because nobody else is willing to talk about it. They're willing to deny it. That's how the NKVD chose to resolve that situation. In other circumstances, they might have gone after the person who told the joke. And if they did arrest the guy who told the joke, the punishment for that person would probably be harsher than the people who heard it. Although also perhaps not. Perhaps they'd all be punished equally, right? It doesn't really matter. The logic is not based on any type of merit that the joke tellers or the people have. It's not based on any action. It's based on an assumption. We need to do this. We're right. We need to return things to the correct natural state of things where no joke about Stalin gets made. This brings me to the final section of this video where I want to talk about Inclusionary versus exclusionary fascism. I've been thinking long and hard throughout this entire war about the particular nature of Russian imperialism, the particular nature of Russism, which is a term I actually came up with before Ukrainians even started using it. I've been thinking a lot about how to qualify this beast because something always didn't feel right in comparing Russia to other countries. And this is why I think I differ from the analysts of Western analysts that are pro-Ukraine even. This is why I differ from them in how I think they don't get the character. Because the thing that's different about Russia, that's always been different about Russia, is that Russia is poor. The people in Russia live in miserable conditions. Many people in Russia, they don't have access to clean water. They don't have access to indoor plumbing. They live in better conditions in cities, at least now, given Western given Western influence and all of the imports and all the businesses that came in from the West. But they don't have good conditions out there throughout most of Russia. They don't have a lot of possessions. They don't have good quality homes, good quality furniture, and anything. They also don't have good quality industry. They don't produce anything, right? If you look at the Russian economy, it's an economy that's very heavily dependent on natural resource exports, namely oil and gas, and everything that they benefit from, they basically import and don't produce themselves. I'm not going to go into detail about all that, but the fact of the matter is, the further east you go, the worse the conditions get. Russia's conditions are poor. And you might think to yourself, well, hold on. If Russia's conditions are poor, you would think that they would hate their government and their country, right? You'd think that they have this resentment towards it, but they don't. A lot of them defend it. A lot of them defend it. And the only other examples, it's almost like North Koreans defending North Korea, except that North Koreans are completely cut off from the rest of the world, right? Russians are not. They have the internet, some of them, and they still defend Russia, despite Russia's conditions being so poor. How is that possible? How is that possible? What's different about Russian Empire and other empires is that most other empires are not empires that perpetuate misery for their own people. You think about the British Empire, the American Empire, the Roman Empire. I mean, I might be butchering history here, but you don't get the impression that these empires were bad to their own people. They were bad to other people. They were bad to the people they colonized in Africa and India and so on. They're to the Native Americans, but they weren't bad to their own people. Their own people prospered as a result of their imperialism. Whereas Russian imperialism, the people of Russia did not prosper. They were always doing worse. How does that work? Why is it that there's this different dynamic? And I think it's like there's actually a fundamentally different category at play here, and that's why. All fascisms have similarities. All imperialisms have similarities. And not all imperial nations are fascist, but all fascist nations eventually become imperialistic or are already imperialistic. All imperialisms have a tacit, we're better than you sort of attitude. And all imperialisms use tricks to justify their interventions, and all imperialisms lie. And of course, all imperialisms commit atrocities and war crimes and will pretend that they didn't happen and things like that. And they may all borrow from both left-wing ideas and right-wing ideas. There's symmetries on a basic level, just like there's symmetries in the comparative geopolitical analysis stuff. All countries do things, all countries have self-interest, etc., etc. But there's differences. There's differences even though there's similarity. The symmetries are regarding the elements of behavior, not the forces driving their behavior. The main difference between most imperialism and most of the fascism that we're used to, the main examples I'm going to refer to are going to be Germany, Japan, and America and the West as examples of imperialisms, not fascisms. But the main logic that they follow, the main dialectical driving force is we're better than you, and because we're better than you, we're going to do things to you. Like, we're better than you, and because we're better, we have a right to basically either own you or possess you or do something to affect you or to do something or to impose our laws on you. I mean, that's the logic that would be applied to the Native Americans, for example. We're civilized, you're uncivilized, so we're going to impose our laws. And I'm not even saying that logic is necessarily even wrong. I think it depends. It could be right, and it could be right some of the time. It could be wrong some of the time. But it's not wrong. I'm not talking about the rightness or wrongness of different imperial actions necessarily, because I might have some imperialistic attitude myself. But what I'm trying to talk about is the structure of it. Obviously, there's a point at which imperialism becomes wrong, and there's a point at which it becomes fascism. And the logic that it follows usually is, because we're better, we're going to take possession of you, or we're going to exterminate you. The logic is exclusionary in the sense that they put themselves in a different category and use themselves being further up to push the other group down. What Russia does is the opposite. What Russia does is uses an inclusionary logic. Russia assumes that they're already in a position of ownership, and that the other group doing things to defy them is them trying to deviate and tend away from the natural state of being owned by Russia. That's how their mentality works. They presuppose ownership to begin with. We already own you, and you're being rotten and evil by trying to disobey. So we need to return you to your natural state of being owned by us. That's the difference between inclusionary and exclusionary imperialism. Exclusionary imperialism doesn't presuppose ownership. It starts from a position of, we don't own you, but when we decide we're better than you, then we will own you. Russia starts from a position of, we already own you, and when you start to do things to defy us, that's when we're going to force you back in ownership with us. Of course, rationally, you might think, Creamy, that doesn't make any sense. Like, obviously, logically, in the causality of events, you can't own a group before you come to own them. But we're not talking about the causality of events. We're talking about the mentality. When Russian colonists, I want to look at the history of Russian sort of like Far East colonialism to see how it works. Regardless of how it worked back then, this is how it works now. They don't go into a region and decide based on what they see whether they should own the people or not. They go into a region presupposing that they own it and simply doing whatever they want to the region. And when people start to defy them, then they start thinking and arguing, well, you're doing things to resist your natural state of being owned. It's kind of like the Borg. It's like you're already, you don't exist. You're just there to be assimilated. You're there to be assimilated, and we're going to assimilate you because why are you defying us? And this is where they start to play victim too. They will play victim when they're being defied, right? But this fits into the model though, right? They play victim because from their position, they're already in a position of ownership. So you defying them is you doing things to their property and harming them. That's how the self-victimization thing works into their framework. I know that this categorization makes sense because it fits so well with everything we're seeing about Russian fascism versus, say, German fascism. German fascism is exclusionary. It's based on a logic of, we're better than you, so we're going to push you down to push ourselves up. We're better than you, so because we're better than you, we hate you and you're evil and you need to be purified. Russian fascism is based on, you're better than us, so we need to pull you down to our level. That's also why the presupposition of ownership is there before action. It's there because there's a negativeness in their perception of the entire world. Their entire worldview begins from a position of inadequacy because they're doing worse, which is why rather than working as a push, it works as a pull. Exclusionary fascism is pushing others down to push yourself up. Inclusionary fascism is pulling others down to pull yourself up. Yeah, pulling others down to pull yourself up. That's how Russian fascism works. It's an inclusionary framework. Rather than trying to push, they're trying to pull. The reason this works, and this makes sense in the way that their sense of self. The German, while all fascisms are based and built from some type of insecurity and fear of the other and feeling of inadequacy, right? Not wanting to feel inadequate, the exclusionary fascists push you down through exclusion because secretly they believe they're better than you. Whereas inclusionary fascists pull you down because they secretly believe they're worse. And that's the fucking point. Russists deep down do believe that they're worse than the West. That's why they're doing this. Them believing they're worse is why they're pulling you down. Unlike the German fascists, it's all based on insecurity, but it's not a relativistic, it's not a relativistic insecurity. In the minds of exclusionary fascists, the push is real because they actually have a reason to think themselves better. Inclusionary fascists don't have a reason to think themselves better. That's why their formalization of fascism is always a pull in their direction rather than a push away from them. Okay, that's how German fascism works. They're purifying their nation and pushing unwanted groups out or exterminating them. Whereas Russian fascism it pulls everything in. Groups that want to leave are being pulled in and not allowed to leave. The way to understand this as well is if you understand the nature of societies in terms of relative and absolute value. All fascisms and imperialisms employ the unequal treatment of people, but the logic is different depending on the absolute value of the society to whom the imperialists and fascists belong. You have to understand that relative value is purely comparative. It's not indicative of how harsh or good or beautiful things are on an absolute scale, right? Whereas the absolute value of things is purely qualitative indication of how harsh or fair things are. The relative measure of things is not an indication of how bad things are. Let me put it like that, right? You can see this very easily if you look at, say, arguments about inequality. Arguments about inequality only compare the richest person to the poorest person. And they say things are bad because the rich is that much richer than the poor. What they don't do is measure the absolute scale of things. Okay, in other words, the poorest person relative, or the average person relative to the absolute bottom of human existence imaginable. Because when you compare the rich to the poor, you're not comparing the poor to the bottom. You're comparing the poor to the rich. The context of this comparison is limited to the difference between the two, not to the absolute difference of things across experiential reality. That's why, so for example, you could see this in wealth inequality arguments. The poorest person in society could hypothetically be a millionaire by today's standards. We could construct a society where the poorest person is a millionaire and the richest is a quadrillionaire or a quintillionaire. And you could still argue about inequality in that society, right? You could still argue about inequality. But on an absolute scale of development, living as a millionaire by today's standards is way better than living as a homeless person by today's standards. That's the difference between relative and absolute value. So I'm going to talk about this concept in other videos a lot because it's a concept I think is very important. But what defines an exclusionary versus inclusionary fascists and imperialism is where their own society is in terms of absolute absolute value, right? And you can think of absolute value between societies as sort of a relative measure, but a relative measure that is global rather than a relative measure that is local to an existing society or country. Although I think that there's an absolute scale that goes beyond what's global, but because there's an absolute scale that goes across all potential, experiential realities, right? So the difference is that exclusionary fascists are exclusionary because they are high or higher than others on the absolute value scale. Their absolute value is positive relative to some metric or KPI out there, which permits them to view the world as basically impure and gross and disgusting and needing to be purged of all of the lesser beings than themselves. Okay? They are the better master race after all. That's how the exclusionary mindset works. This fits in perfectly well with both Germany and Japan. Okay, Germany and Japan were successful societies. I also do, in terms of hate, people have debated whether Japan is a fascist country, but in terms of the amount of hate they had, I always sort of consider them as a fascist nation in World War II. But in any case, internally, as societies, on that absolute scale, Germany and Japan were very high up. They're very high up. Weimar Germany was not doing badly. They had all sorts of problems after World War I, but they weren't doing the worst in Europe. They were a successful society, and by virtue of their success, justified looking down on others and wanting to push them further down to go even higher, right? It's insecurity coupled with some type of success on a functional or other level on the absolute scale of value. Inclusionary fascists are inclusionary because their absolute value is low or lower than those around them. So they seek to pull others down, okay, to their level and push themselves up in the process, thus proving their strength, right? That's their logic. It's a logic born out of they're doing better than us and we hate them because they're doing better than us, which is absolutely present in this war in Ukraine. It's 100% present in the behavior that the Russists have done in Ukraine. It's one of the reasons why there's all these reports of them just attacking infrastructures and monuments and hospitals for no reason. Or not just attacking military targets, attacking these things for no reason is what people are reporting. The reason they're doing that is it's that inclusionary hate. It's a hate based on a resentment of the fact that the others are doing better, not that the others are doing worse. Okay, so they seek to pull others down to their level and push themselves up. Okay, it's like the difference between a machine that is functioning that tries to destroy other machines in order to improve its functioning even more versus a machine that's dysfunctional and tries to corrupt and destroy other machines in order to ameliorate its own dysfunctional position. Do you see the difference? Like the one's position is positive, the other's position is negative. Or rather, the exclusionary fascist attitude comes from a position that's positive, whereas the inclusionary one comes from a position that's negative. Exclusionary fascists resent because they have some reason to think themselves better. Inclusionary fascists resent because they think themselves and know themselves to be worse. Which is why I do think that deep down, the Russian people and the Russians do know that they're doing worse than Europe and worse than Ukraine. And that's part of what motivates their hatred. The inclusionary are barely surviving while the exclusionary are thriving. Exclusionary thrive by pushing others down and exploiting them or just straight up exterminating them because they hate them so much. They're impure after all. And the inclusionary survive by pulling others down to their level. It's a top down versus bottom up attitude. The ones at the bottom, it's like misery loves company. They want to pull others down into their filth. All makes sense when you look at it in terms of absolute value, since the absolute value will tell you how the types will behave. If a country is successful and imperialistic, they're going to look like Germany and Japan or Italy. If they're successful and they start to become fascist for some reason, it's going to end up being the kind of fascism that is focused, targeted, and incredibly destructive towards people. If they're a society that is impoverished and doing worse and unfree, their fascism will be inclusionary. They will seek to pull others into their world and they will seek to destroy them in the process, and by making themselves better only by pulling others into their misery. Their hatred will be less focused. It'll be aimed at anyone who's doing better than them, and thus it won't be as targeted towards specific ethnicities necessarily. The hatred of the Russia right now, not simply aimed at Ukraine. It's aimed at Poland, it's aimed at the Baltics, it's aimed at the whole West. They're fighting all of NATO after all. It's aimed at anyone who's against them, anyone who's doing better than them. And that's not just based on the fact that those groups are all fighting against them. The hatred is a fascistic hatred. It's a hatred that stems from having worse conditions, being used to worse conditions in your own country, and aiming that resentment back at the countries that you want to blame for your own shitty condition. Inclusionary versus exclusionary fascists will exhibit different tendencies with different styles of war criminality at the same time. This is me trying to predict how I imagine they would work, but the difference will look sort of like this. Inclusionary fascists, if you can imagine their psychology, inclusionary fascists are probably going to be more guilty of things like theft, marauderism, destruction of infrastructure, which we hear a lot about in this war. Okay, a lot of these stories and images of Russians stealing pots and pans and washing machines on their tanks and children's toys and all sorts of shit that they're stealing. A lot of destruction of people. This is where I hate the idea that people are going to say, oh, other armies did that too. This is the problem, right? All armies do bad shit, but this is why we have to get into that comparative analysis thing to see the difference in the tendencies of how different armies and empires behave. Because I think there are still going to be differences. I don't think the Nazis robbed or marauded Eastern Europe as much as the Russians are marauding in Ukraine, simply based on the intuition that their own lives back home are probably better than the people that they're attacking. Same thing with American soldiers in Iraq. American soldiers in Iraq are not... They're still going to steal, but they're not going to steal as much in as kind of vulgar a fashion because they don't have the same conditions back home as the Russian fascists. The Russian soldiers have worse conditions. That's why they're stealing washing machines and toilets. So, but anyway... we have to... I want to avoid the conversation of just comparing the different armies because these comparisons are actually very hard to do. You have to look at a lot of evidence. But let me just explain the dynamic that I predict will happen. The dynamic is that inclusionary fascists are going to be more guilty of things like theft, marauderism. They're going to be more guilty of just random attacks against infrastructure that have no purpose. We've heard stories about shit like that happening in Russia too. Like... tanks aiming at a monument or at a hospital and just shooting it even though it's not a military target. Stories where they've shot hospitals as they were retreating. There was no military purpose to shooting it, but they did it anyway. The reason that you're seeing that is because in the mindset of inclusionary fascism, it makes sense to just target things in general because the resentment is aimed at everything. It's aimed at the wealth of the people that they're attacking, not just the people themselves. Exclusionary fascists are probably going to have more war crimes in the form of murder, mass execution, and rape because their hatred is more focused and targeted at the people themselves. This is why even the Russian fascism, you're never going to see something like the Holocaust. You're never going to see an industrial murder of Ukrainians on that scale because that's very targeted. You might see mass murder, strewn across multiple years. That adds up to the same amount of murder as the Holocaust. But you're not going to see mass murder targeted in that way. The hatred of exclusionary fascists is focused because they know who they are and they don't hate themselves as much as they hate the group that they're targeting. Inclusionary fascists will exhibit rape and murder the same as exclusionary, and they might exhibit it in more heinous ways than the exclusionary ones because their rapes and murders are motivated by a general hatred of everything, right? Their resentment is aimed in a very broad sense. It's not targeted, right? But they won't exhibit a focused hatred towards specific groups. This one's a little bit weird, but what I'm trying to basically say is the reason you're hearing about some of these very heinous war crimes is because the standard of atrocity itself is lower. Not that the hatred itself is aimed. So for example, that the Russian soldiers may not rape as many Ukrainian women at the same rate as Japanese soldiers raped in Nanking, but the rapes that they will commit will be more heinous on average. That's why you might get instances of things like raping children in front of their parents and raping children to death and raping infants, right? These insane war crimes, just completely ludicrous levels of war criminality that we're hearing about happening because the hatred is so... The hatred being broad and not focused allows them to... Basically, why are these crimes happening? First of all, they're happening because people are recording, these fucking lunatic soldiers are recording videos to then sell as dark web content for a few rubles. That's why they're doing it. The hatred is less focused, but it allows for deeper levels of depravity to be reached across the board. The hatred is less focused, but it allows a deeper level of depravity to be reached in general by individual actors amongst the soldiers because of how much resentment there is against things in general. Because they are coming from a position of being worse, they're capable of anything. On the other hand, the Japanese soldiers, for example, that committed all the atrocities that they did to the Chinese women in Nanking, probably wouldn't come back home and do the same thing. If they came back home, they would probably treat Japanese women different, or Japanese women better, as well as Germans. They would treat their own fellow Germans well, but the others, the Jews or the Slavic people that they viewed as lesser people, they would treat very poorly. In the case of inclusionary, they view everyone poorly, right? Because their own conditions are poor. They view all people as non-people. So they will commit the same war crimes back home that they will commit in Ukraine. Those are the kind of tendencies I'm seeing. Like I said, the difference between exclusion and inclusionary is that exclusionary is aimed more specifically, which is why the worst crimes will happen specifically to that group. Inclusionary is aimed broadly, so you're not going to see the same crimes on average, but you're going to see heinous crimes pop up all over the place, seemingly at random, for no explicable reason, unpredictably, because the hatred is aimed so broadly. That's the difference between exclusionary and inclusionary fascists. The one hatred is based on pushing the other group out. We hate them, we think them as lesser, we want to either destroy them, exterminate them, or possess them and own them. Inclusionary is based on a feeling of we are worse than the group that we hate. We are worse, which they know deep down, they can't admit it, but they know they're worse. So their hatred is aimed broadly to just do damage in general. And if war crimes like atrocities and like rape happen, they don't happen in a methodical, targeted way. They happen randomly across the board and in more heinous ways because we're coming from a lower position than the other group. Coming from a lower position in absolute value means the people that are doing it are used to a harsher standard of depravity, I guess is what I'm trying to say. They're used to more depraved conditions back home, which is why they will do depraved things when they go into war more often. But it's not going to be focused. It's going to be broad. These are the differences that I'm seeing between the exclusionary and inclusionary fascists. This is a way of thinking about fascism that, as far as I can tell, is completely new. No one else has thought of this yet. And I think it's one of the reasons people fail to predict certain things about this war and how it works. And how Russia seems to work. They seem to try to apply the exclusionary fascist lens to all fascisms and imperialism, and describing Russia, applying that same model to try and explain Russia. And because of that, it fails to predict certain things and fails to appreciate the harshness with which certain things and certain actions are taking place. Whereas from my lens, anytime we find out about some horribly harsh thing Russia does, to me it makes perfect sense because Russia's coming from a position of greater harshness on that absolute value scale in general. They're coming from a position of being beneath Ukraine in terms of harshness, or above Ukraine in terms of harshness. So that's why they're just bringing that harshness to Ukraine when they go to war. They're coming at this from being lower, so they're pulling the other group down, rather than coming from a position of being higher, or thinking of themselves higher, and pushing the other group down. In conclusion, understanding these dynamics of fascism is going to be important for trying to resolve the issue of fascism in the 21st century. There's clearly overlaps as well between what I'm calling inclusionary fascism and what is considered, in general, left-wing authoritarianism, which we've talked about. It's very obvious, and Bolshevik-style communism. It's very, you can see the parallels between the ideology of Bolshevik communism and all the things I mentioned. The idea of owning things before doing something comes from a Bolshevik view of the world. Communist view of the world is exactly that. Everything is already owned by us because everything is owned by everyone. It's that mentality. Because the notion that everything is already owned by everyone justifies acting like the state already owns things because everything is already owned. There's never a situation in an ideology, in a worldview like that, where things are not owned by anyone, or things are free to be owned by whoever. There's no notion of things being owned freely, because everything is strictly owned by everyone. It's already in a position of being owned. Something that anarchists and left-wing radical thinkers probably underestimate when they, like people like Rousseau underestimate when they talk about how everything is owned by everyone. They don't imagine the concept of everything being owned by everyone being imposed harshly on reality. They imagine that if everything is owned by everyone, then everything is free to be owned by whoever. That's not necessarily true. If you force the idea that everything's owned by everyone, you're going to get inclusionary fascism. You're going to get exactly what happened in Russia under the Bolsheviks. This overlap between left-wing authoritarianism and inclusionary fascism, I mean, it's no surprise when you look at it like from this lens that communism ended up working in a country like Russia, working, quote unquote. It ended up taking off and determining. It ended up succeeding, let's put it like that. It ended up succeeding in the country of Russia and not in any other country. And that in other countries you saw fascism take off, like in Germany, right? But in Russia it was communism. Communism never worked in America, but in Russia is where it took off, precisely for this reason. Because if you look at left-wing thinking in general, left-wing thinking is always negative. It's always assuming the negative before the positive. Right, which is where this idea of owning everything before it's owned comes from. I think this study of Russian fascism is super, super important in understanding not just the nature of fascism, but understanding the nature of communism, understanding the nature of left-wing authoritarianism. And it kind of gets to the point that Bolshevik-style state communism is literally just a veil for what is now called inclusionary fascism. It's literally just a fascism based on inclusion into the community, where equality equates misery to depravity, right? Because that's the thing with inclusion, right? You don't want to be included if you're included into something miserable, okay? But then here you go. Here's a society that's based on inclusion that wants to bring everything and everyone down to its level, right? Into its, down into its filth and its dirt, so that it can wallow in it freely. That's inclusion, and it's a dangerous kind of inclusion. Okay, it's an inclusion nobody wants to be included into, but the logic of including everyone into the community fits right in. So I really think that this idea of inclusionary fascism is a hugely important aspect of understanding the Russian world, Russism, as well as far left ideas in general, and what's called left-wing authoritarianism. I think if we want to get to a place of truly, I think we are already in a place as a species where we understand the problems of exclusionary fascism and that type of colonialism very well. We understand the concept of pushing others down perfectly. We do not understand the concept of pulling others down. We don't get that idea, and that idea may become very relevant in this next century as the world becomes more globalized. The threat of societies and ideologies that aim to pull things down is going to be greater than ever, and we need to understand this if we're going to progress as a species. And of course, it's super important for Ukraine. I mean, I barely talked about Ukraine specifically. I mostly focused on Russia, but I don't need to talk about Ukraine. I mean, based on everything I said, you can see who I support. And you know who I support based on who they're up against. And I am Ukrainian after all. Slava Ukraini!